There's a kind of silence that only the loudest voices know. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is not the silence of surrender. It is the silence that waits on the other side of a decade of screaming, not in anger, but in song, in message, in the desperate human need to be understood by millions of strangers. It is the silence that greets a man when the curtain finally falls and the crowd is gone, and the only sound left in the world is a child breathing softly in the next room. John Lennon knew that silence. He had spent the better part of his life filling it with guitar chords, with lyrics that rewrote the emotional vocabulary of a generation, with declarations that shook governments and moved crowds and changed the way ordinary people thought about peace, about love, about what music was supposed to do in the world. He had been one of the loudest voices of the 20th century, and then in 1975 he chose to stop, not because he had run out of things to say, not because the world had stopped listening. He stopped because a child was born, and for the first time in his life, John Lennon decided that the most important thing he could give was not a song, it was his presence. But what no one knew then, what even those closest to him could barely understand, was what happened inside him during those 5 years of quiet, what letters he wrote and never sent, what melodies he hummed into the dark and never recorded, what it cost him to step away from the identity that had defined him since he was a teenager in Liverpool, and what it gave him that no amount of fame ever could. This is that story, not the story of the icon, not the story of the Beatle. The story of the man who chose silence and what he found there. He was born into a world that was already breaking. Liverpool in 1940 was a city under siege. The German Luftwaffe bombed it relentlessly, and the dockside streets where Julia Stanley brought her son into the world carried the smell of smoke and salt water and disrupted lives. John Winston Lennon arrived on October 9th of that year in the middle of a raid in a city trying to hold itself together. His parents could not. Alfred Freddy was a merchant seaman, present in the way that men who spend months at sea can only be partially present, occasionally, passionately, and then not at all. Julia was beautiful and unconventional and too young in spirit for the weight of domesticity. When John was barely 5 years old, his parents separated, and the question of who would raise him became a source of conflict so painful that John himself would carry its mark for the rest of his life. It was his Aunt Mimi, Julia's older sister, who stepped in. Practical where Julia was impulsive, firm where Freddie was absent, Mimi took John into her semi-detached house on Menlove Avenue and raised him with a discipline that he would both resent and quietly rely upon. But Julia never disappeared entirely. She visited. She played banjo and sang and laughed too loudly and introduced young John to Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly. She taught him his first guitar chords on a cheap instrument, laughing when he got it wrong, cheering when he got it right. Julia was the permission he needed. Mimi was the structure he could push against. Together, without fully intending to, they shaped someone who would spend his entire creative life living in the tension between those two forces, the need for love and the instinct to resist it, the longing for belonging and the drive toward independence. But that was not the whole story, because the music, when it came wrapped in grief. In July 1958, Julia Lennon was struck by a car and killed. John was 17 years old. They had been building something together, a second chance at closeness, awkward and tentative and real, and then she was gone. The grief that followed was not the clean, expressible kind. It was the jagged, wordless kind that a 17-year-old boy in 1958 England had almost no language to process. You did not speak about these things. You did not cry in public. You picked up your guitar and you played louder and you made jokes that cut a little too deep, and you told yourself that the hardness forming around your heart was actually strength. John Lennon carried that grief for the rest of his life. It appeared in his music in ways that were sometimes obvious and sometimes so layered into melody and metaphor that listeners felt its presence without being able to name it. It was there in the ache of certain vocal phrases. It was there in songs about longing and absence and the specific loneliness of someone who learned early that the people you need most can simply vanish without explanation. That is what great songwriting actually is, not cleverness, not technique. It is the transmission of something true, something that could not be said any other way. And the place where that transmission began was a room in Liverpool with a guitar and a boy who had just learned that love was not guaranteed. By 1960, the Beatles were beginning to take shape, raw, hungry, playing Hamburg clubs for 8 hours at a stretch in front of audiences who wanted noise and heat and something that felt alive. John was the center of gravity even then, not always the most technically accomplished, but the one you could not take your eyes off, the one whose energy organized the room around him without him seeming to try. The partnership that would define the group creatively was the one between John and Paul McCartney. They were opposites in almost every way that mattered. Paul was melodic, optimistic, meticulous. John was angular, sardonic, driven by instinct rather than craft. Where Paul reached for the beautiful, John reached for the true, and more often than not, the truth he was reaching for was uncomfortable. Together, they created something neither could have made alone, a sound simultaneously smooth and sharp, accessible and challenging. Full of light and threaded through with shadow, the Beatles became everything. There is almost no way to describe adequately what happened to popular culture in the early 1960s when that band arrived, except to say that the world divided cleanly into before and after. They appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, and 73 million Americans watched, and by morning the conversation about what music could mean had permanently changed. John was 23 years old, already married secretly to Cynthia Powell. Their son Julian had been born the year before, but the world knew only the grinning, witty Beatle with the quick answer and the songs that seemed to pour out of him effortlessly. The effortlessness was a performance, the grief was not. The mid-1960s turned everything inside out. The Beatles stopped touring in 1966, and what happened next was something that could not have been predicted from the outside, because what happened next was entirely interior. John Lennon went inside. The lyrics had been changing, getting stranger, more layered, more willing to ask questions that did not have answers. He had been reading Eastern philosophy, the works of people who thought about consciousness and meaning and the spaces between thoughts. Strawberry Fields Forever arrived in 1967, a piece of music so unlike anything that had come before it that people who heard it for the first time described a physical sensation, as if something in the air had shifted. It was hallucinatory and tender and deeply autobiographical. The strawberry field of the title was a real place, a Salvation Army children's home near Menlove Avenue, where young John had played as a child, peering through the gates at a garden that felt like another world. He gave people words to hold on to, even when he himself was still searching. The song was about the impossibility of certainty, the sliding, unreliable quality of memory and self. Nothing is real. It was one of the most honest things he had ever committed to record, wrapped in an arrangement so peculiar and beautiful that most listeners could not have told you why it moved them, only that it did. This was John Lennon at the height of his creative power, not comfortable, not certain, but absolutely alive to what he was doing. And that was where the distance between the icon and the man began to grow most visible. By 1969, the Beatles were ending. The dissolution was complicated and painful, not because of one dramatic moment, but because of accumulated weight, creative differences, financial disputes, the exhaustion of being part of something so large and demanding for so long. John was already moving toward a rower, more confrontational voice. He married Yoko Ono in March 1969. Their relationship had become one of the most controversial in public life, not because of anything either of them had done wrong, but because the world had decided Yoko was a disruption into something it considered its property. The hostility directed at her was often ugly, and John's defense of her was absolute. They staged bed-ins for peace. John returned his MBE to Buckingham Palace. He wrote Give Peace a Chance and Imagine, the latter becoming over time one of the most recognized melodies ever recorded, a 3-minute vision of a world without the divisions that cause human suffering. The public figure was enormous, the message was real, but the private man beneath it was also exhausted, searching, carrying wounds that the anthems could not heal. What the audience heard was a declaration. What he carried was something older and quieter. In October 1975, Shantara Ono Lennon was born. John was 34 years old. Julian, his first son, was 12, and the relationship between them had been fractured by the demands of fame and the collapse of John's first marriage. John knew this. He had lived it from the other side, had spent his own childhood scanning the horizon for a father who kept not appearing. He was not going to repeat it. The decision to step away from music, to become what he called a house husband, to take primary care of Sean while Yoko managed their business affairs, was not made lightly. There were people who did not understand it, who interpreted it as weakness or creative paralysis or surrender. The music industry had no framework for a man who simply chose his child over his career. but John Lennon had spent 15 years being exactly who the world wanted him to be. He had earned the right to choose differently. What followed was 5 years that almost no one witnessed directly. He woke early. He baked bread, became genuinely skilled at it, proud in the small domestic way that fame never allows. He walked Sean through Central Park and watched the boy discover pigeons and puddles and the specific joy of leaves that crunch underfoot in autumn. He read voraciously. He waited outside Sean's music lessons in the hallway and thought about things that were not songs, except that some of them were, because John Lennon did not stop writing. He never stopped writing. Impulse was too deep, too fundamental, but what he wrote during those 5 years was different. It did not go into a studio. It did not get arranged and mixed and shipped to radio stations. It went into notebooks, onto scraps of paper, into the small cassette recorder he kept by the bed for when something arrived at 3 in the morning and demanded to be captured before it dissolved back into sleep. There were songs about Sean, tender, almost painfully private things, written for one listener and never intended for millions. There were songs about stillness, about the particular quality of light in the Dakota apartment in the late afternoon. There were songs that circled the old grief, his mother, his childhood, the jagged edges that decades of success had never fully smoothed, and approached it from new angles with a patience the younger John would not have had the capacity for. And there were letters he wrote constantly, to old friends, to his sons, to Yoko, to himself, in journal entries that veered between mundane domesticity, what Sean had eaten, grocery lists, observations about the weather, and passages of such raw introspective honesty that the people who later read them described feeling like they had opened a door they were not meant to open. Many of these letters were never sent, not because they were not sincere, but because John had learned, perhaps for the first time, that some things did not need an audience, that the act of putting words on paper, forcing the shapeless noise inside into something with structure and clarity, was itself the point, not the transmission, the act. This was completely new for a man who had spent his entire adult life communicating to the world, who had measured his worth in part by the size of the crowd that heard him. But there was something no one in those quiet Dakota corridors could fully see. The man was changing in ways that would have made extraordinary music if he had lived to make it. There were mornings when he sat at the piano in the White Room and played for no one, not the compositions that would eventually become double fantasy. Those came later. These were private improvisations, just his hands on the keys and his voice humming wordlessly, and the light coming through Central Park-facing windows in long golden stripes across the floor. Sean would sometimes wander in and sit beside him on the piano bench. John would shift to make room and keep playing. Sometimes Sean would press a key experimentally. John would incorporate the note, and they would look at each other and laugh. These moments, unremarkable in their smallness, were the ones John later described as the closest he had ever come to understanding what peace actually meant. Not the peace of the protest sign, not the peace of the anthem, the peace of a morning with nowhere to be and a child at your side and music that needed no justification because it was for no one and nothing except the playing of it. He gave himself permission to be ordinary. It was the most radical thing he had ever done. And slowly something healed that 15 years of public life had not been able to touch. The wound that had opened in July 1958 on a Liverpool street began to close, not completely, but enough to breathe around, enough to look at directly without flinching. He wrote a letter to Julian during this period, a long one, covering ground they had never covered in person, acknowledging failures that a younger John would have been too defended to admit. Whether it arrived in the form he intended is something only they could know, but the letter was written, and the writing of it was its own form of reckoning. That was where the story became something more human than the public version had ever allowed. By 1980, John was ready. He and Yoko had been working on new material. The songs were warmer than the confrontational anthems of the early 1970s, marked by the particular quality of someone who has been through the fire and come out the other side not unscathed but still standing. Double Fantasy was the result, a record that felt, to those who listened carefully, like a conversation between two people who had survived something together and were still here, still capable of joy. Beautiful Boy, the song he wrote for Sean, was unlike anything he had ever recorded. It was simple, almost bare in its arrangement, and it said directly, without irony or edge or the protective armor of abstraction, that he loved his child and was grateful for him, and understood that life was fragile and not to be wasted in the relentless pursuit of things that ultimately do not matter. He meant it. This was not performance. This was a man who had spent 5 years learning something the world he had returned from rarely stops long enough to learn, that the present moment, inhabited fully, is enough. The album was released in November 1980. John gave interviews. He was relaxed in a way that surprised journalists who had expected the sharp-tongued provocateur. He talked about Sean constantly. He talked about bread. He laughed more easily than people remembered, he described. The 5 years away not as a retreat, but as an education, the most important he had ever had, the only one that could not have been given to him by anyone else. He said in one interview that he was not afraid anymore, that whatever happened next, he had done the thing that mattered most. He was 40 years old. He had no idea that next month was all he had left. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota Building. This story will not dwell there, not because the loss was not enormous. It was, individually and collectively, a wound in the culture that has never fully closed, but because what John Lennon left behind was not defined by the manner of his leaving. It was defined by everything that came before: the music, the message, the 5 years of deliberate silence, the bread baked in a quiet kitchen, the letters writ and unsent, the mornings at the piano with his son beside him. The applause had been real. The silence had been real, and what he had discovered in that silence remains real long after the voice that articulated it was gone. Decades later, people still return to his music the way they return to something they cannot quite finish with, not because it is unresolved, but because it is inexhaustible. Each listening catches something not audible before. Each year of one's own life brings new entry points into songs that seemed, on first hearing, to be about something entirely different. That is the mark of writing that came from somewhere genuinely true. Sean Lennon grew up to be a musician. He carries his father's voice in ways that are sometimes startling, not just physically, but in some quality of emotional directness, some willingness to put the undefended self into the music and trust that honesty is more interesting than polish. And the songs endure. Imagine plays in moments of collective grief and collective hope around the world, its melody instantly recognizable across languages and generations. Strawberry Fields Forever still sounds like a dream you're trying to hold on to as you wake. Beautiful Boy still sounds like a father bending over a sleeping child in the dark, overwhelmed by the specific gravity of love. These songs came from somewhere real, from a boy on Menlove Avenue who lost his mother and learned to carry that loss in music. From a young man in Hamburg who played until his fingers bled and discovered what it felt like to be heard. From a husband and father and restless, contradictory, thoroughly human person who spent 5 years in a Dakota apartment rediscovering things that fame had told him were peripheral, and found, to his own surprise, that they were central. The letter he never sent, the one to himself about what mattered, about what he had learned in the silence, was written in those years in the only language he had ever fully trusted. It was written in music, and it plays still. What happens when the loudest voice in a generation chooses deliberately to be quiet? What does it find there, and what does it leave behind for the rest of us to hear? The answer is in the music. It always was.